Officer Matthew Reynolds responded to a 911 call about a robbery at Memorial Hospital's park. He heard the description, black male in a hoodie. And the moment he arrived and saw Leonard Vaughn, a 34-year-old paralyzed Army veteran, sitting in his wheelchair waiting for his driver, Reynolds walked straight toward him, ignored the fact that Leonard was clearly in a wheelchair, and accused him of being the robber. When Leonard told him he wasn't the robber and that he was actually the victim who had just been robbed moments earlier and that he was paralyzed from the waist down, Reynolds dismissed it as a lie. He told Leonard to stop fooling around and get up. And when Leonard asked how he could possibly be a robber when he was paralyzed, Reynolds said, "Exactly, because you're not paralyzed," and he grabbed him to drag him out of the wheelchair. Leonard fell to the ground in pain and shouting that he couldn't walk. Reynolds didn't stop. He cuffed Leonard on the pavement, ignored bystanders who told him Leonard had been robbed and was paralyzed, and kept him pinned to the ground and cuffed him. What Officer Matthew Reynolds didn't know, what he was about to learn after dragging a paralyzed veteran out of his wheelchair and leaving him on the pavement in handcuffs, was that his actions were witnessed by a dozen people with cameras, that Leonard Vaughn was a decorated Army veteran who had lost the use of his legs serving his country, and that his refusal to listen would cost him his badge and result in a $10.1 million lawsuit that would become one of the largest excessive force settlements in the state's history. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. And if you believe a paralyzed veteran should never be dragged out of his wheelchair by a cop who refused to listen, like this video and subscribe. Memorial Hospital on a late Tuesday afternoon had the rhythm of controlled chaos that all hospitals have. Ambulances pulling in and out of the emergency bay, visitors coming and going through the main entrance, staff moving between shifts, and in the small park area just outside the main doors, a handful of people sat on benches waiting for rides, making phone calls, or just taking a moment to breathe outside the sterile air of the building. Leonard Vaughn wheeled himself out through the automatic doors at 4:47 p.m., the same time he did every Tuesday after his weekly checkup. He was 34 years old, a former Army specialist who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before an IED explosion outside Kandahar in 2018 changed his life in a way that no amount of physical therapy would ever fully reverse. The blast had left him paralyzed from the waist down, and for the past 6 years he had lived his life from a wheelchair, navigating a world that wasn't always built for people like him. He came to Memorial Hospital every week for checkups related to his spinal injury, and the routine had become familiar enough that he didn't think about it much anymore. Park in the accessible spot near the entrance, wheel himself in, see the doctor, wheel himself back out, wait for his driver to pick him up. Today was no different. He wore a black hoodie against the slight chill in the air, jeans that hung loose over legs he couldn't feel, and sneakers he couldn't tie himself. The medical wristband from today's appointment was still on his left wrist. His phone was in his hand. His bag was on his lap, holding his wallet, his VA medical card, and a folder of paperwork from the appointment. He positioned his wheelchair near a bench in the park area, pulled out his phone, and texted his driver to let him know he was ready. The driver replied that he was 15 minutes out. Leonard put the phone back in his lap and looked around, watching the people coming and going, waiting the way he had waited 100 times before. That was when he saw it happen. About 30 feet away, near the other side of the park, a man in a black hoodie walked up behind a woman sitting on a bench. The man grabbed her purse off the bench, yanked it out of her hands, and took off running toward the parking lot. The woman screamed. Other people turned to look, but no one moved fast enough to stop him. Leonard didn't hesitate. He pulled his phone back out and dialed 911. The line connected almost immediately. 911, what's your emergency? I just witnessed a robbery at Memorial Hospital, Leonard said, his voice calm but urgent. The park outside the main entrance, black male wearing a hoodie just grabbed a woman's purse, and he's running toward the parking lot. Can you describe the suspect? The dispatcher asked. Black male, hoodie. Leonard was focused on getting the information out quickly, watching the man disappear between rows of parked cars. He's heading east toward the parking structure. While Leonard was still on the phone, the robber looked back over his shoulder, saw Leonard sitting in his wheelchair with the phone to his ear, and realized immediately what was happening. Leonard was calling the cops, and Leonard was in a wheelchair, which meant he would be easy. The robber changed direction mid-run and came straight toward Leonard. Leonard saw him coming, but there was nothing he could do. The robber reached him in seconds, grabbed the bag off Leonard's lap with one hand, snatched the phone out of Leonard's other hand, mid-call, and took off running again without saying a word. Leonard shouted after him, "Hey, stop!" But his voice didn't carry far enough, and the robber was already gone, disappearing into the parking lot with Leonard's bag, his phone, his wallet, and everything else he had on him. Leonard sat in his wheelchair, breathing hard, his hands empty, and looked around at the other people in the park. The woman who had been robbed was still sitting on the bench crying. A couple of bystanders had gathered around her. No one had chased the robber, no one had stopped him, and Leonard couldn't chase him either. He sat there paralyzed in more ways than one and waited for the police to arrive in response to the call that had been cut off. 6 minutes later, Officer Matthew Reynolds pulled up in his patrol car. Reynolds was 31 years old with 6 years on the Charlotte Police Department. He worked patrol in the downtown district, and over those 6 years, he had built a reputation that his supervisors had documented but never addressed. 4 formal complaints from black men over the years, all claiming Reynolds had used excessive force, made assumptions based on race, or escalated situations unnecessarily. All 4 complaints had been investigated and dismissed. The pattern was there, written into his personnel file, but no one had ever done anything to stop it. When the dispatch call came in that afternoon, all Reynolds heard was this robbery in progress at the Memorial Hospital Park. Suspect described as black male in a hoodie. He drove over without asking for more details. Reynolds pulled into the hospital parking lot, scanned the park area, and his eyes locked onto Leonard Vaughn sitting in his wheelchair near the entrance. Black male hoodie sitting right there in the open. Reynolds got out of his car and walked straight toward Leonard without speaking to anyone else, without asking the woman on the bench what had happened. Without observing the scene for even 10 seconds, he had already decided what he was looking at. He stopped in front of Leonard's wheelchair and looked down at him with an expression that said he had found exactly what he was looking for. You're under arrest." Leonard looked up confused and caught completely off guard. "What?" "I'm not." Reynolds cut him off, and his voice loud and aggressive. "You match the description. Black male in a hoodie. Get out of the chair now." Leonard's heart started pounding. This wasn't right. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. "Officer, I'm not the robber. I'm the one who called 911. The robber just robbed me too, and I'm paralyzed from the waist down. I can't stand." Reynolds crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "Yeah, right. Sure you are. You can't fool me. Dispatch was clear. Black male, hoodie. You matched the description perfectly." Leonard tried again, his voice steady but urgent. "Officer, I was just waiting for my driver after coming out of the hospital. I saw the robbery happen and I called it in. Then the guy robbed me. I'm paralyzed. I can't walk." Reynolds leaned in closer, his tone turning sharp and condescending. "Shut up and stand up before I drag you up myself." Leonard felt the panic starting to rise in his chest. He didn't have his phone. He didn't have his bag. The robber had taken everything, and now he had no way to prove who he was. "I don't have my phone or my bag. The robber took them, but you can verify my story inside the hospital. I just had an appointment. They have all my records." Reynolds ignored him completely. "How are you going to be a robber when you're paralyzed?" Leonard thought for a second that maybe Reynolds was starting to understand that maybe the question meant he was listening. Exactly. That's what I'm trying to tell you. I can't. Reynolds interrupted him, his voice flat and certain. Exactly. Because you're not paralyzed. I'm fooling around. Leonard stared at him in disbelief. What? Reynolds reached for his radio and called for backup. Then he turned back to Leonard, his hand moving to rest on his holster. Get up now. A woman nearby who had seen the whole robbery happen stepped forward, her voice shaking but clear. Officer, he's telling the truth. He got robbed and he's in a wheelchair. He's clearly paralyzed. Another bystander joined in. We saw the whole thing. The guy in the hoodie robbed him and ran that way. He pointed toward the parking lot. Reynolds turned toward them, his voice hard. Stay out of it. I have this under control. He turned back to Leonard and his voice dropped to something colder. Get up now or I'm dragging you out of that chair myself. Leonard's voice rose, desperation cutting through. I'm paralyzed. I can't get up. And that was when Matthew Reynolds lost whatever patience he had left. He grabbed Leonard by the arm and yanked him forward with enough force to pull him out of the wheelchair. Leonard's body came forward, but his legs didn't respond. They couldn't. He fell hard onto the pavement, his legs twisting beneath him in ways that would have hurt if he could feel them, and pain shot through his lower back where his injury was. He hit the ground and immediately shouted, his voice breaking, I can't walk. This is assault. Reynolds didn't stop. He flipped Leonard onto his stomach, pulled his arms behind his back, and cuffed him roughly on the pavement. Leonard's face was pressed against the concrete. His wheelchair tipped over beside him, and bystanders were shouting now, some of them pulling out their phones to record. Backup sirens were already getting closer, and Leonard Vaughn, a decorated army veteran who had lost the use of his legs defending his country, was handcuffed on the ground outside the hospital where he had just finished his weekly checkup, being treated like a criminal by an officer who refused to listen to a single word he said. Leonard lay on the pavement with his face pressed against the concrete, his hands cuffed behind his back, and his legs twisted beneath him in positions that would have been painful if he could feel them. His wheelchair was tipped over 3 feet away, one wheel still spinning slowly from where it had fallen. Officer Matthew Reynolds stood over him with one hand on Leonard's shoulder, keeping him pinned to the ground, and Leonard could hear the backup sirens getting closer with every second that passed. The bystanders, who had witnessed everything, were still shouting. A woman near the bench was yelling at Reynolds to let Leonard go, telling him that Leonard had been robbed and was clearly paralyzed. An older man was holding up his phone, recording the whole scene, and telling Reynolds that he was making a huge mistake. Another person was trying to explain to Reynolds that the real robber had run toward the parking structure and was long gone by now. Reynolds ignored all of them. He kept Leonard pinned on the ground and waited for backup to arrive. The backup cruiser pulled up less than 2 minutes later, and Sergeant Mike Dawson stepped out. Dawson was 43 years old with 15 years on the Charlotte Police Department, and he was Reynolds' senior officer. He had seen a lot of situations go wrong over the years, and he had developed an instinct for recognizing when something didn't add up. The moment he stepped out of his car and saw the scene in front of him, a man in a wheelchair tipped over, another man handcuffed on the pavement, and a crowd of bystanders yelling at Reynolds, that instinct kicked in hard. Dawson walked over quickly, his eyes moving between Reynolds, Leonard, and the wheelchair. "What's going on here, Reynolds?" Reynolds looked up at him, his expression defensive but confident. Suspect matches the description. Serge, black male in a hoodie. He's resisting. Leonard turned his head as much as he could from his position on the ground. His voice strained but clear. "Sergeant, I'm paralyzed. I'm a veteran. I was robbed. My name is Leonard Vaughn. My bag was stolen. That's why I don't have my ID on me, but you can verify everything inside the hospital. I just had an appointment today. They have all my records. Reynolds cut in before Dawson could respond. "He's lying, Sarge. He matches the description perfectly. Black male in a hoodie? That's what dispatch said." Dawson looked down at Leonard and his eyes moved to Leonard's legs, which were lying at awkward angles on the pavement in a way that didn't look natural. He looked at the tipped wheelchair. He looked at the medical wristband, still visible on Leonard's left wrist. Then he looked back at Reynolds. "Did anyone else see what happened?" Dawson asked, raising his voice slightly so the bystanders could hear. The woman who had been robbed first spoke up immediately, her voice shaking but angry. "I saw everything. That man, right there." She pointed at Leonard. "He got robbed. The guy who robbed me came back and robbed him too. He took his phone in his bag and he's paralyzed. He's been in that wheelchair the whole time." The older man holding his phone up added, "The real robber ran that way." He pointed toward the parking structure. "That guy on the ground didn't do anything. He called 911. He's the victim." Another bystander, a younger woman who had been sitting on a bench nearby, stepped forward. "I watched the whole thing. The robber took his stuff and ran. This officer showed up and went straight to him without asking any questions. He dragged him out of his wheelchair. We all saw it." Dawson's jaw tightened. He looked at Reynolds again. "You dragged him out of his wheelchair?" Reynolds' confidence wavered for just a second, but he pushed through it. He was resisting. He wouldn't stand up when I told him to. Leonard's voice came from the ground again, louder this time and edged with pain. "I told him I was paralyzed. I told him I couldn't stand. I can't walk, Sergeant. My legs don't work." Dawson crouched down next to Leonard, close enough to see the strain in his face and the way his legs weren't moving at all, despite the awkward position they were in. Dawson had been a cop long enough to know what real paralysis looked like, and this wasn't someone faking it. This was someone who genuinely could not move his lower body. Dawson stood back up and looked at Reynolds with an expression that was no longer questioning. It was certain. "Stay here. Don't move him." Reynolds opened his mouth to say something, but Dawson was already walking toward the hospital entrance. Dawson pushed up through the automatic doors and walked straight to the front desk where a nurse was sitting behind the counter. He pulled out his badge and held it up. "I need information on a patient, Leonard Vaughn. He says he had an appointment here today." The nurse looked at the badge, then at her computer screen, and typed in the name. A few seconds later, she nodded. "Leonard Vaughn." "Yes, he had a physical therapy appointment this afternoon at 3:30. He's a regular patient here. Has been for about 6 years. Dawson leaned forward slightly. "Can you tell me why he's a patient here?" The nurse looked at the screen again. "Spinal injury. He's paralyzed from the waist down. He's a veteran. The injury happened during his service." Dawson felt his stomach drop. He looked back toward the automatic doors toward the park where Reynolds still had Leonard pinned on the pavement in handcuffs. "Thank you," he said quietly, and then he turned and walked back outside. When Dawson came back through the doors, Reynolds looked up expectantly, like he was waiting for confirmation that he had been right all along. But the expression on Dawson's face told him immediately that he was about to hear the exact opposite. Dawson walked straight to Reynolds, and his voice was low, but hard enough to cut through steel. "Uncuff him right now." Reynolds blinked. "What?" "But Sarge, I said. "Uncuff him now." Reynolds hesitated for just a second too long, and then Dawson's voice got louder. "That's an order, Reynolds. Uncuff him immediately." Reynolds finally moved. He pulled out his keys, crouched down, and unlocked the handcuffs from Leonard's wrists. Leonard brought his arms forward slowly, wincing as circulation came back into his hands, and Dawson stepped in to help him sit up. Dawson crouched down next to Leonard and spoke quietly, his voice carrying a weight that wasn't anger, but something closer to regret. "Mr. Vaughn, I am deeply sorry for what just happened to you. This should never have occurred." Leonard was breathing hard, his hands shaking slightly as he rubbed his wrist where the cuffs had been. "He dragged me out of my chair. I told him I was paralyzed. I told him I was robbed. He didn't listen to a single word I said." Dawson nodded. "I know. I verified everything with the hospital. You're a patient there. You're paralyzed. You're a veteran, and you were robbed." He looked over his shoulder at Reynolds, who was standing a few feet away, looking like he had just been hit by a truck. This was wrong. All of it. Dawson helped Leonard back into his wheelchair, riding it first and making sure it was stable before carefully lifting Leonard and positioning him back into the seat. Leonard settled into the chair with visible relief, his legs finally in a position that didn't put pressure on his injured spine. Reynolds tried to speak, his voice defensive and stammering. "I didn't know. He should have made it clearer from the beginning. I was just following the description." Dawson turned on him, and the look on his face made Reynolds stop talking immediately. "You assaulted a paralyzed veteran in front of witnesses. All of this is on camera." He pointed at the bystanders who were still holding up their phones, still recording. "You dragged a disabled man out of his wheelchair because you refused to listen when he told you the truth." Reynolds looked around at the phones, at the bystanders staring at him with expressions ranging from anger to disgust, and the reality of what he had just done started to sink in. Dawson pulled out his radio and called for EMS to come check Leonard for injuries. Turning to the onlookers, he requested they remain so he could gather their accounts. A number of them readily agreed, offering to forward the recordings they had captured. Leonard, still seated in his mobility device, bore the marks of the encounter. His wrists were crimson from the restraints, and his back throbbed from being forcibly removed and flung to the asphalt. He met Dawson's gaze and stated softly, "I wish to lodge a formal grievance, and I require the body camera footage." Dawson acknowledged this with a nod. "You shall have it. I am ensuring this incident is documented precisely as it unfolded." Reynolds, still present, appeared to be searching for words to dissolve the situation, but no utterance could erase the events that had just been preserved by over a dozen personal devices and his own recording equipment. Dawson directed Reynolds to return to his vehicle and await further instructions. Reynolds departed at a leisurely pace, with Leonard observing his retreat, acutely aware that this ordeal was far from concluded. Moments later, paramedics arrived and conducted an assessment of Leonard's physical state. They identified contusions on his wrists, abrasions on his arms resulting from the drag across the pavement, and recommended he be readmitted to the hospital for a spinal examination to ascertain if the fall had precipitated any additional damage. Leonard consented, but prior to re-entering the building, he looked once more at Dawson. "This predicament befalls individuals daily, does it not?" he mused. "Those who lack immediate hospital access to validate their experiences, those without witnesses armed with cameras." Dawson offered no reply, merely a somber nod. Leonard then propelled himself back towards the hospital entrance, confident that the injustices he had endured would cast a lasting shadow over Matthew Reynolds' future. He re-entered Memorial Hospital, and the EMS team escorted him directly to the emergency wing for a spinal evaluation. Medical professionals conducted a battery of tests to confirm the fall had not exacerbated his pre-existing spinal cord compromise. X-rays revealed no new fractures, but the bruising on his back and the strain on his lower spine indicated he would experience considerable discomfort for several days. He was administered pain relief. His wrists, bearing the deep crimson imprints of the handcuffs, were bandaged, and he was advised to consult his primary care physician within the week. While Leonard was undergoing his examination, Sergeant Mike Dawson remained outside in the park, diligently collecting statements from every bystander who had witnessed the event. He interviewed the woman who had been the initial victim of the robbery, who provided a detailed description of the perpetrator, taller than Leonard, younger, with a different physique, and clad in a dark gray hoodie, not black. He spoke with the elderly gentleman who had meticulously filmed the entire interaction, who then presented Dawson with the footage depicting Reynolds forcefully removing Leonard from his wheelchair and throwing him to the ground. He also spoke with the young woman seated on the nearby bench, who informed Dawson that Reynolds had approached Leonard directly without first questioning anyone else. Dawson obtained contact details from 6 distinct witnesses, and their accounts were remarkably consistent. Leonard Vaughn had been seated in his wheelchair, peacefully awaiting transportation. The actual assailant had pilfered the woman's handbag and subsequently robbed Leonard. Leonard had initiated a call to 911, and Officer Matthew Reynolds had arrived, disregarded the patent evidence before him, and physically assaulted a man with a mobility impairment based on a vague resemblance. By the time Leonard emerged from the hospital 2 hours later, Dawson had already submitted his preliminary report and flagged the incident for an internal affairs inquiry. He had also submitted an urgent request to secure Reynolds' body camera footage, stipulating that it must not be altered or deleted in any manner. Dawson met Leonard at the hospital's exit as Leonard wheeled himself back outside. Leonard's driver had finally arrived and was waiting in the designated pickup zone, but Leonard paused upon spotting Dawson maneuvering his wheelchair towards him. "How are you feeling?" Dawson inquired. Leonard's expression was weary, and a subtle tension, absent before, now creased his eyes. "I've experienced better days. They found no new damage to my spine, but my back will ache for some time, and my wrists," he held them up, now swathed in bandages, "are going to be quite bruised." Dawson nodded. "I've gathered statements from everyone who observed the proceedings. I've also secured Officer Reynolds' body camera footage. Everything he did is documented. Everything you stated is on record, and I've already escalated this for internal review." Leonard regarded him for an extended period. "What transpires next?" Dawson took a breath. "Frankly, this will be pursued to its ultimate conclusion. Reynolds subjected a disabled combat veteran to an unwarranted assault. He disregarded numerous witnesses. He refused to confirm your account, even when you provided precise instructions. He infringed upon your rights and inflicted physical harm. This is not a matter the department can conceal, particularly with such a wealth of corroborating evidence." Leonard's jaw tightened. "Excellent, because I have no intention of letting this slide." Dawson met his gaze. "You should not. What he perpetrated against you was reprehensible, and I will ensure my report meticulously details every aspect." Leonard nodded slowly. "I wish to submit a formal complaint, and I require a complete copy of all documentation, the body camera footage, the witness statements, everything." "You shall receive it," Dawson confirmed. "I will arrange for its delivery to you within the week." Leonard propelled himself towards his awaiting driver, but before entering the vehicle, he turned back to Dawson one final time. "I served 2 tours in Afghanistan. I sustained injuries defending this nation. I lost the use of my legs, and today I was forcibly removed from my wheelchair and flung onto the pavement as if I were a criminal because a police officer perceived a black man in a hoodie and deemed that sufficient justification." Dawson remained silent. There were no words that could diminish the stark truth of Leonard's statement. Leonard continued, his voice steady, yet imbued with a gravitas that lent weight to each syllable. "My mobility device was insufficient. My hospital identification bracelet was insufficient. My explanation that I am paralyzed was insufficient. The witnesses attesting to my robbery were insufficient. Nothing sufficed except what he had already concluded about me the instant he saw my complexion." He paused, looking past Dawson towards the spot on the pavement where he had been restrained less than 3 hours prior. "I am initiating legal action a federal civil rights violation, excessive force, discrimination based on disability, assault, all of it, and I will ensure that the public is fully informed of today's events." Dawson nodded. "You possess every right to pursue such action." Leonard looked at him once more. "I do not seek an apology from him. I do not desire his contrition. I demand accountability. I want him stripped of his badge, and I want the department to comprehend that this cannot persist." He wheeled himself to the van, and his driver assisted him with the transfer from his chair to the passenger seat. Dawson watched the van depart, then turned back towards his patrol car, where Matthew Reynolds was still seated, presumably hoping the incident would simply fade away. It would not. By that evening, the videos had begun to proliferate. The bystanders who had filmed the event uploaded the footage online with captions such as "cop drags," "paralyzed veteran out of wheelchair," and "officer assaults disabled man for sitting in a park." The videos garnered hundreds of shares within the initial hours. By the following morning, they had been viewed more than 3 million times. Matthew Reynolds' name was appended to every single one, and Leonard Vaughan's face, the visage of a man who had served his country, lost the use of his legs, and was then treated as a criminal for occupying a wheelchair, while black became the emblem of a narrative that captivated public attention. The Charlotte Police Department issued a statement the subsequent day, labeling the incident as under investigation and pledging transparency. However, the videos were irrefutable, the witnesses truthful, and the body camera footage secured by Dawson meticulously documented every second of Reynolds' actions. Leonard retained a civil rights attorney. Within 48 hours, the attorney reviewed the evidence, the body camera footage, bystander recordings, witness testimonies, and medical records from Memorial Hospital, confirming Leonard's paralysis and patient status, and informed Leonard that this presented one of the most unambiguous cases of excessive force and disability discrimination he had encountered in his career. The lawsuit was formally filed 1 week later, and Matthew Reynolds, who had forcibly removed a paralyzed veteran from his wheelchair based on a refusal to believe a black man's account was truthful, was poised to discover the significant financial repercussions of his presumptions. The videos achieved viral status with unprecedented speed. Within 72 hours, the footage of Officer Matthew Reynolds physically expelling Leonard Vaughan from his wheelchair and propelling him onto the pavement had been viewed in excess of 20 million times across various digital platforms. Every major news syndicate seized upon the story. The image that became ubiquitous was a frozen frame from one of the bystander recordings, Leonard on the ground, his legs contorted beneath him, his wheelchair overturned, and Reynolds standing over him, handcuffs in hand. The headlines practically wrote themselves: "Cop drags paralyzed veteran out of wheelchair," "Officer assaults disabled Army vet after robbery," "Paralyzed man handcuffed on pavement for fitting vague description." The Charlotte Police Department attempted to control the public perception through carefully constructed statements, but their words were powerless against the visual evidence that millions had witnessed firsthand. Matthew Reynolds was suspended indefinitely within 48 hours of the incident. The Internal Affairs investigation proceeded with remarkable celerity due to the overwhelming nature of the evidence. Reynolds' body camera footage captured the entire sequence: Leonard repeatedly stating his paralysis, Leonard explaining he had been robbed, bystanders vociferously proclaiming Leonard was the victim, and Reynolds disregarding all of it, physically extricating Leonard from his wheelchair. Furthermore, the investigation delved into Reynolds' personnel file, revealing information that exacerbated the situation considerably. Over the course of his 6 years on the force, Reynolds had been the subject of 4 formal complaints filed by black men, each alleging the use of excessive force or the making of racially motivated assumptions. All 4 complaints had been documented and subsequently dismissed without significant repercussions. The pattern had been evident all along. inscribed within his professional record, yet the department had failed to take any remedial action. 3 weeks following the incident, Matthew Reynolds was discharged. The official findings cited violations of departmental policy concerning the use of force, a demonstrable pattern of racially biased policing, assault on a disabled individual, and a failure to substantiate facts prior to taking action. He was 31 years old with 6 years of law enforcement experience, and no other police department in the state was willing to employ him. His name became irrevocably linked to one of the most widely disseminated instances of police brutality and disability discrimination ever captured on camera. Leonard Vaughn initiated a federal civil rights lawsuit against Reynolds and the Charlotte Police Department. The lawsuit alleged excessive force, unlawful detainment, contravention of the Americans with Disabilities Act, failure to accommodate a disability, assault and battery, along with deliberate indifference to Leonard's civil rights. The city's legal team reviewed the evidence, the body camera footage, multiple bystander videos, 6 witness statements, and medical records from Memorial Hospital, and opted to reach a settlement rather than proceed to trial. They recognized that no jury would side with an officer who had forcibly removed a paralyzed veteran from his wheelchair in plain view of numerous cameras. The settlement was finalized at $10.1 million, one of the most substantial settlements for excessive force in the state's history. Leonard allocated a portion of the settlement to establish the Vaughn Foundation, a nonprofit entity dedicated to providing legal assistance and resources to disabled veterans who have experienced discrimination or mistreatment. He emerged as a prominent advocate for police reform, disability rights, and accountability within law enforcement. He provided testimony before municipal councils and state legislators, underscoring the imperative for enhanced training in disability awareness and the inherent dangers of racially biased policing. The Charlotte Police Department implemented comprehensive reforms in the wake of the incident. All officers were mandated to complete compulsory training on disability rights and the Americans with Disabilities Act. New protocols were instituted requiring officers to verify claims and amass evidence before resorting to physical force. An independent civilian review board was established to adjudicate complaints of excessive force and discrimination. Body camera footage underwent quarterly audits to identify patterns of biased behavior before they escalated into violent confrontations. 3 other officers with disciplinary histories comparable to Reynolds were discreetly reassigned from active patrol duties to administrative tasks. The actual perpetrator, who had absconded with Leonard's bag and cellular device, was apprehended 2 weeks after the incident during an unrelated arrest. He was identified via surveillance footage from the hospital parking lot and was found in possession of stolen items belonging to multiple victims, including Leonard's phone. He was subsequently charged with multiple counts of robbery and sentenced to 8 years in prison. Leonard's recovered possessions were returned to him. 5 years later, Leonard Vaughn continues to reside in Charlotte. He still attends Memorial Hospital weekly for his medical checkups. He continues to utilize a wheelchair and vividly recalls every moment of the day he was forcibly removed from it and flung onto the pavement, accused of a transgression he did not commit, for the sole offense of being black and fitting a description that was never actually his. Matthew Reynolds has not been employed in law enforcement since his termination. He appealed his dismissal twice, with both appeals being denied. He attempted to secure employment in private security but was repeatedly rejected once background checks revealed his documented history. His name consistently appears as the primary search result for examples of police misconduct against disabled individuals. The case has become a seminal example utilized in police academies and civil rights training programs nationwide. It is presented as a clear illustration of the consequences when officers disregard evidence, refuse to listen, and permit bias to supersede sound judgment. The lesson is straightforward, yet its teaching came at a cost of $10.1 million, one man's career, and the dignity of a paralyzed veteran. A wheelchair is not a veil of invisibility. Paralysis is not a fabrication. And the refusal to listen carries a price far exceeding any reasonable expectation. If you believe a decorated war veteran should never be forcibly removed from his wheelchair for occupying a public space, while black, please share this account. What reforms do you believe every police department ought to implement to safeguard disabled individuals from such acts of violence? Share your thoughts in the comments section. And if this narrative has reinforced your understanding that assumptions inflict irreparable damage and that disregarding truth carries a significant penalty, please subscribe. Our commitment is unwavering until every officer comprehends that a badge does not grant license to ignore what is unequivocally right.